I can see that some people maybe were out a little late last night. Having a good time. That's allowed, though discouraged. No. Capitalists deploy a cultural strategy to create a specific working class or citizenry that will serve their needs at any given historical moment. Labor historians have focused on these processes at the point of production, the factory floor, and social reproduction and the community. I argue that in addition to these moments of influence, capitalist control of culture extends into the point of household reproduction. It is here, in the home, where women are the primary force and source of workers. As wives, women reproduce the worker daily and weekly. As mothers, they reproduce the working class generationally. As homemakers, women are responsible for setting the tone of social mores and the new work ethic as prescribed by capital. During the era of monopoly capitalism, roughly 1880 to 1945, the significant task of the industrial capitalist was to transform farmers and immigrants into factory workers. Women, as the primary power of household reproduction, had to be taught how to produce an industrial workforce. They too needed to be transformed into cheap caregivers of the era, what I call industrial wives. The forces of transformation I address today include the medicalization of pregnancy and childbirth and the creation of a science of parenting as tools to create the ideological industrial wife. As in all facets, here too, capital and the state work in conjunction to meet the needs of capital. Together they serve to create a concerted, somewhat coordinated effort to transform, effort of transformation around ideologies of women as wives, mothers, workers, and above all, the foundational actor of household reproduction, the giver of care, cheap care. I used pamphlets printed and distributed by the government and local corporate publications to illuminate and illustrate the new ideology for women. I examined general trends in the United States while using specific examples from the history of New York's Southern Tier during the era of E.J. Shoes. George F. Johnson of E.J. Shoes in the Triple Cities of New York understood the task of transforming farmers and immigrants into American working class families. He did this in three significant ways. He created an elite stratum of the working class to serve simultaneously as role models and a disciplining force. He built loyalty between workers in the firm and the Johnson family through community philanthropy. He published a workers' magazine that went into worker homes where he could simultaneously transform women into industrial wives. Industrial wives, relative to women who had been farmers, were paramount in service to the transformation of farmers of all genders and ages into factory workers of the present and the future. Antonio Gramsci wrote of the creation of the new industrial man through the use of force and persuasion. He argued that hegemony, discipline, and a moral policing were required to rein in the animal instincts of workers. George F. Johnson, co-founder of E.J. Shoes and undisputed father of the Triple Cities, did just that. Known as George F., in addition to creating the new industrial worker, he also had to remake the family and, most important, women. The new industrial wife was sometimes a wage worker, but she was always a wife and a mother, a domestic worker, a cheap caregiver. If she weren't already a mother, this was the goal. Her job was to reproduce the workers day to day and generationally. At its peak, E.J. Shoes employed 60,000 of the 60% of the industrial workers in the area, over 20,000, and produced more than 52 million pairs of shoes a year. Like other firms in the era of monopoly capital, Johnson integrated vertically and horizontally. As early as 1903, the company began selling shoes directly to dealers, thereby bypassing the middleman. E.J. was the first in the industry to open retail store outlets. E.J. established tanneries and component facilities to produce linings, heels, shoes, and all the parts of the shoe. Johnson built a rubber reclaiming and manufacturing plant in 1922 that used old car tires as the primary source for rubber heels. In the same year, company sales were just under 75 million. During the 1920s, there were about 20,000 workers. In 1930, the company had 18,000 employees working in 28 plants, producing 45 million pairs of shoes a year. The U.S. government issued EJ shoes to soldiers in both World Wars, making it the company's largest client. During the war years, the company produced 52 million pairs of shoes a year. In the mid-1950s, the workforce was about 17,000. It was during the late 1950s and early 1960s that the company began its slow decline until the last shop was sold in 1994. EJ required a steady workforce in both senses of the word. Johnson needed a solid number of workers to make shoes, and he needed them to be reliable. He created not only the factories, but also the town. His hegemony over the workers stretched beyond the factory floor and into all reproductive spheres of life. Many welfare capitalists had a vision for their company towns. We think of places like Hershey, Pennsylvania, the sweetest place on earth, where, while off the clock, workers were monitored and policed. And Pullman, Illinois, with draconian policies affecting workers in the company factories and at home in company housing, for which they paid exorbitant rents. We think of the chorus of Ernie Ford's 16 Tons. You load 16 tons and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. George F. Johnson of EJ Shoes had a different, more utopian arrangement in mind. He had a vision. Johnson was consistent and diligent in creating and maintaining his image as a working man turned boss turned owner, a philanthropist who always had a knack for getting along with others and coming up with a good idea. The backstory that accompanied this image is that from the time he was a young lad, he just felt as if it were right and fitting for workers and managers to live and work together and to live in harmony. In his utopia, the bosses and workers would work side by side, live side by side, and their children would play together, fast friends. When he took over management of EJ Shoes, he began building factories in the middle of a former farm field, about 5 miles from the existing factories. He was known to visit Round Top Park, which offered spectacular views of the Susquehanna River Valley to the east and to the south. Sitting atop the rise, it is easy to imagine Johnson planning and envisioning, dare I say scheming, how his utopia would rise from the land reclaimed from agriculture as the initial streets were laid out and the first factories and houses were built. A staunch welfare capitalist, Johnson's method for preventing unionism was to give workers everything they could possibly want from a union and to remind them of his benevolence at every opportunity. He built well-lit, state-of-the-art factories, cottages to care for long-term ill, fire prevention houses, public markets where local farmers sold negotiated low-priced foods to workers and the rest of the community. When it came to recreation, he provided dance, music, and outdoor sports regardless of the weather. When it came to recreating, he provided very fine company homes, playgrounds for children, and hospitals for care, and of course, maternity wards and pediatricians for the care of mothers and their babies, the future workers of EJ. Controlling working class women and compelling them to raise their children to be good EJ workers was fundamental to George F.'s master plan to create the ideal utopia. The transformation of heterogeneous working class families into unified, homogenized, Americanized working class families was not his task to tackle alone. Supplementing the message of his corporate publications, to which we will turn in just a moment, were the publications of the Children's Bureau of the national government. Combined, these publications directed a clear message to and for the cheap caregivers of working class households. They were told how to live, behave, run their homes, and raise their children. In other words, how to reproduce the working class. At the turn of the 20th century, the idea of parenting went from one of custom to one that could be rescued by science. The mothers and fathers of children born in the late 19th century faced greater complexity and possibilities than previous generations due to the ills of urbanization and industrialization. This is the era that saw the medicalization of birth. The women's suffrage movement created an activist apparatus that had goals in addition to getting the vote. They also wanted legislation around child labor and to reduce infant and maternal mortality. Prior to and after the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920, the maternalism movement made some headway at Washington. Under the slogan, "Save the Babies," politicians and maternalists stood on common ground. There were two outcomes that had long-lasting impact: the Children's Bureau and the Shepard-Towner Maternity and Infancy Act. In 1912, President Taft created the Children's Bureau, still in operation today, with the directive to investigate and report on all matters pertaining to the welfare of children and child life among all classes of our people. In particular, the Bureau was charged with looking at infant mortality and the birth rate, among other items. From 1921 to 1929, the Shepard-Towner Act provided federal funding for maternity and child care. Formerly under the Department of Labor and Commerce in 1912, the Children's Bureau had a budget of $25,000 to investigate and collect data. For reference, the same year, the Department of Agriculture had a budget of $1 million. A worker at the new Bureau remarked, "I see, cows and pigs are worth more than the nation's children." The maternalists wanted more money and a broader mission, but this was the most they could get at the moment when the government was simultaneously concerned about women's growing political power, as evidenced by the suffrage movement, and eager to keep women where they belonged, in the home. The Bureau was headed by Julia Lathrop, and her staff were all women. Their mission was to gather information about birth rates, including infant and mother mortality. At the beginning of the 20th century, for every 1,000 live births, 6 to 9 women in the United States died of pregnancy-related complications, and approximately 100 infants died before age 1. The rates for women and infants of color were higher. It was the Children's Bureau that implemented full nationwide data collection on births, live and stillborn, as well as deaths during infancy. Some at the Bureau recognized the links between poverty and childbirth mortality and wanted to eradicate poverty. The ideology of poverty is that to be poor is a self-inflicted state rooted in an individual's laziness. Therefore, the workers of the Children's Bureau were forbidden to give government funds to poor women and their families. The Maternity and Infancy Act of 1921 provided additional funding to the Children's Bureau and the instruction to formally educate midwives, especially in new sterilization techniques, and to inform expectant mothers on pregnancy and childbirth. They recommended women seek medical attention from qualified physicians for their maternity and birthing needs. The Bureau held midwifery workshops, especially in the South, where midwives attended births for blacks and poor white women, neither of whom could afford medical care. They sought to dispel myths, like that having a sharp knife under the bed or mattress would cut the pain of childbirth. They taught midwives to register birth with the requisite vital statistics of date and time of birth, weight and size of the child, and so forth. The government now required education, testing, and registration for midwives. When the act was passed, nearly half of all births in the country were attended by midwives. 10 years later, in 1930, only 15% of births were midwife attended, though this average is skewed because in the South, blacks and poor whites continued to utilize the practice. Women, especially those living isolated lives, wrote to the Children's Bureau and requested informational and educational pamphlets. The Bureau published a multitude of pamphlets on the topic. First published in 1913, prenatal care and infant care were requested and distributed to millions of women in the country. In prenatal care, the author Mary Mills West offers advice to women in several sections with topics that span the course of pregnancy and childbirth. West includes information about identifying signs of pregnancy, calculating due dates, and managing proper diet, exercise, personal hygiene during gestation. She discusses potential complications such as miscarriage and the development of disease. She outlines what actions to take if complications occur. Step-by-step instructions are included on how to deliver an infant if it must be born at home, with an emphasis on avoiding infection through disinfecting techniques. The final section of the booklet covers nursing and how to maintain a healthy diet while breastfeeding an infant. In the back of the publication, West includes a glossary defining technical words as well as an index. She had an entire chapter dedicated to dispelling myths around pregnancy, like maternal impressions, also known as marking. This is the belief that birth defects were caused by something a pregnant woman saw. For example, it was sometimes supposed that the mother of the elephant man was frightened by an elephant during her pregnancy, thus imprinting the memory of the elephant onto the gestating fetus. Some midwives did not want to be told how to catch babies, but other than that, there was no organized resistance by women for these developments. It was working. Something was working. Infant mortality rates dropped not only because of the work of the Children's Bureau, but also because of sanitation, medical advances, and other changes. In 1935, the infant mortality rate was 55.7 out of 1,000, a significant improvement over the 1900 rate of 100 for 1,000 births. Though these numbers varied vastly over states and rates, and rates for women of color and their infants were always higher. In New York, for example, the overall rate of infant mortality was 48. White infant mortality was 46 out of 1,000, while other races was 83. In North Carolina, rates were only 69 overall. White rates were at 60, while other races were 87. In New Mexico, aggregate rates were 129 deaths out of 1,000. For whites, this was 125, and for other races, 227 infants died out of 1,000. That said, this was an improvement. The work of the Bureau was significant, especially in their role as educators. The Children's Bureau received requests by mail. Many of these letters were from desperate women who were uninformed and ill-prepared for their future as mothers. They had little information and even less in the way of resources. Bureau pamphlets were often their only source of information on the topics. Whenever possible, West encouraged women to go to the hospital for a medical birth. Over the course of the first quarter of the century, pregnancy and birth transitioned from a routine home occasion attended by women, family, friends, to a medicalized event occurring in hospitals. If one were a woman living in Endicott or Johnson City in New York, married to an EJ worker, she was not desperate. She lived in the utopia of George F.'s making, replete with hospitals, maternity care, and rewards for hospital births. For EJ, one of the goals in the first decades of the 20th century was to shape women into wives and mothers whose duty and mission is to reproduce compliant workers daily and generationally. Johnson published daily and monthly missives distributed at the factories and homes. As a cultural medium, the EJ Workers Review shaped material social practices. In addition to shaping an elite stratum of the working class and increasing loyalty between workers and the firm and the Johnson family, it helped to transform farmers into industrial wives and modern mothers who, relative to farmer wives and mothers, were paramount in service to the transformation of all farmers of all genders and all ages into factory workers. The publications gave clear and precise instructions to working class women as to how to be wives and mothers who served the needs of the company. The magazine consists of memorials to fallen soldiers, on honors to returning veterans, pictures and treatises of various recreations provided in part or in whole by Johnson or EJ, child rearing information, pictures and information about various workers' families, poetry, quips, a George F.'s own page, and letters from workers extolling the benefits and virtues of working for EJ. Every issue also had the homemakers page, the future EJ Workers Department, and the Little Mothers League. These last three sections were aimed specifically towards women. The EJ Workers Review was not a sole voice in the night. Its message for women was supported and reinforced by the publication of the federal government's Children's Bureau. Once upon a time, about 100 years ago, in George F.'s utopian community town, there lived the perfect and ideal woman. This utopian woman lived in the pages of the EJ Workers Review. She is the role model for the women in the Triple Cities. She is happy, poised to be adored and emulated. Her children are clean, well-behaved, and obedient. The secret to happiness is to be like her. to do what she does. Not only will you be happy, you too will become a role model, be adored, emulated, a woman of high status. The ideal woman shops at the EJ markets. She may or may not be a worker, but she is certainly married to one, an EJ worker. They qualify for their EJ home because they have children. Her babies are born in an EJ hospital staffed by EJ doctors and nurses, where she receives prenatal care and learns with the other mothers how to raise healthy babies at the weekly baby clinic. On the occasion of birthing an EJ baby, our ideal woman receives a $10 gold coin and photographs of her baby when he is between 6 and 9 months old. Her baby receives a $10 deposit into a bank account and, of course, a pair of shoes, all courtesy of EJ, George F., and his benevolent wife, Mrs. George F., the ultimate role model. These push presents motivated women of Endicott to have babies, and lots of them. Other upstate New York women had 3 to 6 babies, while Endicott's birth rate was double that. EJ women had 6 to 12 babies. Also, it fed the PR machine in the form of thousands of photographs of babies at their most adorable, perfect for compilations like this 2-page center spread and this one. From birth, both boys and girls are always already becoming the future workers of EJ. The girls, however, must become more than that. Young girls are taught the ways of womanhood, i.e. motherhood, at the regular meetings of the Young Mothers League, cooking classes, and other learning opportunities provided by EJ in the community. The ideal woman's daughter is always already becoming an ideal woman. They are the future producers of the workers. Daily, they feed and clothe and get out the door to work current workers. Generationally, they have babies and raise them to be honest and hardworking shoemakers loyal to the EJ family. She is not only the ideal woman of George F.'s Utopia, so too she is the transformed farmer, become industrial wife, her cheap care reproducing and recreating an industrial working class, formed by local corporate magazines and national government pamphlets that created and shaped the new ideology around women in the home. Pregnancy, birth, and child care, child rearing are no longer the purview of women, traditions and practices passed from grandmother to daughter. These are now medicalized, part of science and civilization, rather than nurture and nature. Thank you.